Whatculture.
All things considered, there's quite a lot of trust involved when it comes to governments. You trust that if you abide by the law and get your taxes in on time, then your garbage will be collected, your local services will be well funded, and that they'll keep you safe from any marauding bands of savages. On the whole, they usually do, but if you're also trusting them not to commit terrible atrocities and frame other people for it, well, history suggests that trust might be misplaced. It's quite a tricky business running an entire country, you see, and sometimes you have to bend the rules. I mean, sometimes you have to indulge in savagely brutal criminal behaviour as well, though, and that's why we're here. I'm Adam from Whatculture.com, and these are 8 shocking crimes that were secretly committed by governments. Number 8. The Italian police plant explosives at the G8 summit. In 2001, the G8 summits being held in the Italian city of Genoa were met with heavy protesting. Around 200,000 anti-globalization protesters took to the streets in organised marches before eventually clashing with the notoriously heavy-handed Genoan police department. During one of the protests, a police officer was reported as having been stabbed by a member of the public, and knowing that the bulk of the group's organisation was coming from a local school dormitory, a night raid was organised. 93 arrests were made, and 2 improvised explosive devices were found at the scene. During these arrests, over 72 protesters were injured, with witnesses speaking of riot police beating them with clubs, smashing windows, and destroying computers. However, given the startling stories and figures that emerged from the incident, a number of inquests were launched, and 2 years later, both the stabbing and the bombs were discovered to have been planted there by members of the police force. Senior police chief and head of the Central Operations Services, Franco Gratteri, concluded in the hearing that the stabbing of an officer had been knowingly simulated. Number 7. The USS MAINE sparks the Spanish-American War. Largely concerned with the Cuban War of Independence, itself the result of years of hostility between the Cubans and their Spanish occupiers, the US sought to intervene in the ongoing conflict and liberate the island for their own ends. However, with no easily justifiable interest in the island, they lacked any clear mandate to intervene. That was until the USS MAINE, an armoured cruiser deployed in the region, was mysteriously sunk. A series of explosions ripped through the hull and sent over 260 soldiers to their deaths. After demanding Spain gave Cuba their independence as an apology for the destruction of the MAINE, war was formally declared. Over 100 years later, both Spain and Cuba's official view on the incident is that the ship was deliberately sabotaged by the Americans as a precursor for war. Number 6. Operation HIMMLER. With war an inevitability and Hitler keen to make the first moves, a campaign of national and international propaganda was launched by the Nazis. However, this alone wasn't enough to justify a full military invasion. On August 31st, under cover of darkness, SS personnel, disguised as members of the Polish army, began to storm German border towns, attacking a number of train stations and customs houses. Finally, a radio station in the city of Gleiwitz was hijacked and began broadcasting anti-German messages. When the authorities turned up, they found a number of dead Polish soldiers at the scene. In fact, already dead Polish occupants of a nearby concentration camp who had been dressed up to appear like members of the military. With the world happy to accept that Germany had a justifiable reason to defend its borders, Hitler ordered the invasion the very next day. Number 5. The Soviets bomb their own town to invade Finland. Not wanting to be outdone by their German counterparts, the Russians also manufactured an excuse for themselves to enter the war. Almost certainly worried about how exposed the city of Leningrad was to an aggressive German military, Soviet forces began shelling one of their own towns. Based mere miles from their Finnish border, the Red Army levelled parts of Manila with artillery fire and began a public propaganda campaign to blame it on Finland. A neutral investigation was proposed, but immediately dismissed by the Russians in favour of tearing up their non-aggression treaty. 4 days later, Russian forces crossed the border, sparking the Winter War, which dragged on for months longer than anticipated at the cost of nearly 500,000 lives. Over a decade after the end of the Second World War, the then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev wrote that Manila shellings were in fact organised by Russian forces. Number 4. COINTELPRO. Still allegedly being run to this day, COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was a campaign of carefully orchestrated infiltrations of political organisations by the American FBI. Confirmed targets of the operations were the most vocal of civil rights movements, notable journalists opposed to the Vietnam War, and, most specifically, Dr. Martin Luther King. After King's landmark march on Washington in 1963, then President Herbert Hoover personally charged the FBI with infiltrating King's organizations. Within weeks, King's people were finding bugs and listening devices in every hotel room he was provided. Both journalists and historians have repeatedly claimed that King was sent so-called suicide packages by the FBI, one of which allegedly contained, amongst other things, audio confessions claiming to detail depraved sexual encounters King had had, along with a note that read, "There is only one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." King declined their kind offer. Number 3. Operation AJAX. In 1953, British and US intelligence agencies conceived of a plan to overthrow a democratically elected Iranian leader and, instead, install a leader far more in favour of ties with the United States. From protests to riots, even staging a bombing at the home of a notable Muslim cleric, Operation AJAX turned the general population against their leader. With some 500 people dead, the operation eventually bore fruit when the previous regime was reinstated to deal with the perceived unrest in the country. In exchange for their help in dealing with the situation, the new rulers handed over control of the Anglo-Iranian oil company to the British, a company now known the world over as British Petroleum. Were it not for a series of CIA documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, it's likely this coup would have remained a secret forever. Number 2. The LAVON affair. A year after the commencement of Operation AJAX, and presumably in some part inspired by it, Israel launched its own campaign of covert misdirection. Given the codename Operation SUZANNAH, it consisted of a series of bombings planted by Israeli operatives against British and American-owned communities. The idea, such as it was, would lead to a complete destabilising of the region and enough perceived civil, religious and political unrest that the Egyptians would have little choice but to ask the British government to step in and control the Suez Canal. However, after a series of successful attacks, a poorly rigged bomb caught one of the operatives in the blast, leading to his capture and the exposure of the entire plot. Number 1. The Reichstag fire. Arguably the most famous government-inspired atrocity, simply by virtue of it being the only one currently on most national curriculums, the Reichstag fire was one of the key catalysts in Adolf Hitler's ascension to power. Some 6 years before the Second World War, the Reichstag was burned down in an arson attack. One of the first political figures to arrive on the scene was, conveniently, Prussian Interior Minister Hermann Goering, who immediately outlined plans to quell an uprising and ordered the arrests of several notable communists. From there, the coalition of the Nazis and the German Nationalist People's Party capitalised and, masquerading under emergency powers, suspended the communists' right to assembly and freedom of speech, removing, in the process, their most vocal political opposition in the run-up to the war. So that was a list, not mine of course. Officer and older boy made me say it, but while you're putting the cuffs on me, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Until then, I've been an entirely anonymous whistleblower from Whatculture.com, and you definitely didn't see me.